unique clinical entity. Actually, there is many symptoms which are neuropsychiatric, and there is much overlap with other common diseases of brain amongst the children. It has significant mortality as well as morbidity. And next, please. And what we find is uh, it is a little different from the adult autoimmune encephalitis. As I have said again, there are two components, neurological as well as the psychiatric manifestations, and also the behavioral changes. These behavioral changes are sometimes indistinguishable from the autoimmune encephalopathy. Now, a few words why it happens. Well, I said this is already I have discussed. There is a much overlap. Autoimmune encephalopathy, PANDAS, PANS, anxiety, and other psychological diseases. This amongst the children, this neoplasm, which is a common cause of autoimmune encephalitis amongst the adults, is not really very common cause, and mainly it is the vaccines, viruses, infections, and sometimes the occult neoplasm, for example, teratoma, may cause A. The next point is what happens in this disease. In this disease, what is found that there are autoimmune antibodies, which could be either intracellular or extracellular neuronal antigen or surface antigen. We have to diagnose early. If you don't diagnose early, the treatment is not started early, the prognosis is poor. Next, please. So, and diagnosis mainly by the demonstration of autoantibodies in the blood. Next. I think with these few words, we can go ahead, and I'll actually Dr. Silva, he is the expert, and he is the main person, the key person who will be discussing on this subject, especially pediatric encephalopathy, and that includes encephalitis, autoimmune encephalitis too. And then Dr. Garg, and they are the expert, and we'll just listen what they are going to discuss. Dr. Silva, please.
Thank you, Dr. Silva, for setting the base for the discussion for the next 1 hour or so. We now welcome our next presenter for the evening, Dr. Jeevan Silwal. Dr. Jeevan Silwal is a pediatric neurologist who has completed his MBBS from the SRTR Medical College from Maharashtra and followed that with an MD in pediatrics from Warrior Hospital, Mumbai, and a DNB pediatrics as well. He has acquired a fellowship in pediatric neurology from Kochi, Kerala. He too has dabbled in teaching as an assistant professor at the Nair Hospital, Mumbai. Dr. Jeevan is currently at the Neotia Hospital, Siliguri, West Bengal. He is passionate about pediatric epilepsy and autoimmune pediatric neurology. One of his patients' reviews tells us that he's very knowledgeable and highly soft-spoken, and Plasmagen Biosciences is in complete agreement with this. Welcome aboard, Dr. Jeevan. Over to you now.
Am I audible?
Yes, Dr. Jeevan, you're audible.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your introduction, and thank you, Medula ma'am, for setting up this, setting the tone of the webinar. So, so we'll start with the the first part. There will be two parts. We have divided the seminar into two parts. First part will be covering the basic topics. Yeah, so the overview of my discussion will be I'll be touching up some of the basic terms, the basic concepts about the encephalopathy, and after that I'll discuss a case scenario where a child comes with acute encephalopathy in emergency. How should we go about, how should we think, and how to approach such kind of children. Then I'll touch upon the autoimmune neurological diseases and just give an overview of the autoimmune encephalitis. The detailed part of it will be covered in a second part of the talk by Dr. Meenal. So encephalopathy basically is a presentation how the child comes to the casualty. So it is a syndrome of altered mental status and which manifesting as reduced consciousness or altered behavior. So it suggests that there is some global brain dysfunction, and it's a very broad which describes a clinical picture of altered sensorium. Child can come in altered sensorium. So altered sensorium or altered consciousness can vary from mild lethargy, some drowsiness, stuporous or comatose, or it can just be some subtle behavioral changes like child is confused or persistently irritable or not being able to sleep for a few days. So even this we should consider this, even this feature has to be part of encephalopathy. And this encephalopathy can be acute, subacute or chronic. So there is no any standard duration to say it's acute, subacute, chronic, but roughly less than 2 weeks is considered to be an acute. Subacute means roughly around from 2 weeks to 3 months or 12 weeks, and anything beyond 3 is considered to be a kind of presentation. And the course can be static or a progressive. So the course is mainly defined by the underlying pathology. So a static encephalopathy means like a cerebral palsy child who already has an injury in the past and the pathology is static. But however, a progressive encephalopathy means the disease, the pathology is still progressing and the child will still go deteriorate over the coming period. And so this encephalitis means basically it's a pathological diagnosis. It means that the brain is inflamed, and there are some surrogate markers, clinical markers to say, and some imaging markers to say that there is some evidence of inflammation. In 2013, the International Encephalitis Consortium, they roughly gave a criteria to suspect encephalitis. Any child coming with encephalopathy for more than 24 hours. So this duration is important. So the encephalopathy lasting for 24 hours, and 3 out of the 5 features like fever within first 72 hours, any focal neurological deficits, CSF showing counts of white cells, any EEGs or MRI is abnormal. So with this kind of presentation, we think the child to have encephalitis. The etiology can be common one are the infectious, in which the viral encephalitis are very common. It can still be bacterial, fungal or parasitic, but it is not very commonly encountered. In non-infectious, it is more immune mediated, some metabolic or some toxic related. And so this into this term, the acute encephalitic syndrome. This term was actually started in 2005 by the government of India itself. They published a guideline when there was epidemic of Japanese encephalitis in Gorakhpur, Uttar Pradesh area. Then they defined this AES or acute encephalitis syndrome as any person of any age, any time of the year coming with an acute onset of fever and change in mental status in a form of disorientation or comatose, and or with new onset seizure, excluding the simple febrile seizure. And the initial stages, they can just have some irritability, somnolence, or abnormal behavior, which is greater than seen with usual febrile illnesses. So they have just given a small mnemonic when to suspect. Mainly, this is for a Japanese encephalitis. Fever, stress was the mnemonic. Rash is absent. Epidemic, sensorium is altered, and any focal findings. So. So this is a syndromic presentation. The etiology can be a whole lot of etiology can be there. So common ones are like they are divided into a JE and a non-JE viral. So JE was specially kept, and non-JE viral may be because of arbovirus or enterovirus or even dengue virus. And some they have kept the third column at other causes, which is I think not visible in the slide, but other causes like parasitic or protozoal parasitic like malaria or amoebic encephalitis or some drug or toxin related. So this was roughly the etiology that was given. So I'm coming in the terms only. So I'm coming to this term, which is the encephalopathy, which are very commonly used in pediatric neurology. So any child coming with fever and altered sensorium, so it's a syndromic presentation of encephalopathy, or we can even coin it as acute encephalopathy. And epileptic encephalopathy means child is having a behavioral or cognitive issues, mainly because of the underlying epilepsy, much more than the underlying real pathology. So the concept here is if it is the epilepsy, then the encephalopathy may be revert back to some extent or completely also, like in Landau-Kleffner syndrome or West syndrome or Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. These are the typical epileptic encephalopathies. Then there is a term called genetic encephalopathy or developmental encephalopathy, which means that the developmental delay is mainly because of the underlying genetic cause. So it is commonly like interchanged into genetic or developmental encephalopathy, like single gene disorders like Angelman syndrome or CDKL5 is a kind of a gene, or Rett syndrome is a kind of a gene. So these are called the genetic and the developmental encephalopathy. Now that another concept is coming, like developmental and epileptic encephalopathy. Like for example, Dravet syndrome, which means that a single gene disorder like the sodium channel mutation can cause epilepsy. Plus, it's also cause developmental delay. And even if we are treating the epilepsy, but we are not able to revert back the developmental delay part. So the single mutation is leading to both the epilepsy and the developmental. So this is a new kind of terms. So I'm using these terms not to confuse here. It is just the terms which we have to just understand the concepts of using this term. That's all. So I'll just come to a case scenario where a child comes, normal child, 8-year-old child, previously comes with a short history of fever and upper respiratory tract infections. And then child shows a seizure on day 2 of fever, and after this the generalized seizure, child becomes altered completely, and child was rushed to the emergency department. So how do we go about with when such child comes to an emergency? When we receive these patients or these children, we will just approach like basic ABC kind of approach. We like to see whether the air is okay, the child is breathing properly, there is no any impaired airway reflexes. How's the respiratory pattern, whether there is an acute feature of any raised ICP like persistent posturings are there or not, whether he's maintaining the saturation or not. So we'll check the airway, we'll check the breathing, we'll check the circulation, whether the blood pressure is fine, whether the child will need any boluses, or on top of bolus, whether he will need an ionodrop. So that is a basic approach first, rather than going into the etiology. And with such kind of presentation, when the child comes with very low GCS, we have to see whether any features of cerebral herniations are there. Like we have to check the pupils, whether there is an asymmetry on the pupils, if there is persistent posturing on stimulation. And other thing are like if associated fever is there, we'll treat that. If the child is showing active seizures, we'll try to treat with benzodiazepines, and maybe we can load with a anticonvulsant like that. So after that, we'll definitely think of why the child came with such kind of presentation. So we'll go into the deep of the history. So, but before going into the history part, we should roughly be in our mind, we should think of the causes like infection, whether it is related to trauma or whether child has consumed any drug recently, whether it is metabolic, means related to any low sugar or low sodium, or whether there is an acute hypoxic ischemic event is there, or whether it is a encephalopathy because of a prolonged seizure, or whether there is an underlying tumor. So this is a chart which covers like the causes that I told, but apart from that, I will just like to keep some rare causes like vascular disorders, like any vascular, like inflammatory vasculitis, like CNS vasculitis, or SLE can present with the neuropsychiatric features, or like PRESS syndrome, posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome, like a child with hypertension coming with renal patient coming with sudden encephalopathy. We should think of maybe PRESS at that time. And any child on a background history, child having a developmental delay, and child comes with the encephalopathy, we should think of these rare genetic metabolic causes like Leig's encephalopathy or glutaric aciduria or nuclear cycle disorder. They can come with encephalopathy in a casualty. Other thing is the psychiatric disorders. Psychiatric disorders can just come with some kind of encephalopathy, and the autoimmune and the inflammatory ones like demyelinating disorders like NMO spectrum disorders or obstructive myoclonus ataxia syndrome, or this like antibody mediated encephalitis. So these are the causes we have to keep in mind. Then keeping that etiologies in mind, we'll go and ask the detailed history to the family. Like how was the child before illness, whether there was fever or not, whether there was any flu-like illnesses, whether rash was there or not, because rash can be more seen in like viral etiology. Whether the child come from a very urban or a rural kind of setup, because viral encephalitis are more commonly seen in rural setup, and there may be epidemic in the neighborhood. Whether the child consume any toxins recently, and whether history of trauma is there, any recent travel history is there, whether child received any immunization, because post-immunization child may have developed a like edema-like presentation. Whether the child has seizures in the past, whether any recent history of animal contacts, any insect bite, any dog bite was there, any recurrent similar episodes were there in the past, because recurrent encephalopathy can be pointed toward a metabolic cause. Whether a child has underlying renal issues or kidney issues or liver issues, or child is a case of diabetes mellitus. So all this history has to be taken, whether in the past history of previous infant or child deaths are there, which also points towards the metabolic cause, and how was the child before the illness. So this roughly history we have to ask. Then we have to go for focused examination. On general examination, we'll see how is the whether there is a pallor, jaundice, any skin rashes, any petechiae is there, any parotid soiling there, any organomegaly there. So all these points to a specific kind of some pointers will be there, like a pale child maybe because of the cerebral malaria or with history of trauma, we can have interest in bleed. Jaundice can be due to some bacterial or even some hepatic encephalopathy. Rashes are seen more in viral and plus some bacterial like meningococcemia. Parotid soiling is seen in mumps. Organomegaly may be there in scrub typhus, malaria, and this presence of eschar will be very diagnostic for scrub typhus. So apart from that, we'll just see the how is the pulse and the blood pressure of the child, what's the respiratory pattern. So this roughly will indicate whether any feature of raised ICT is there or not. We should check for the GCS, how are the pupils, whether any focal deficits are there, whether any posturings are there, how is the meningeal signs are there or not. So these are the things we have to look for during the examination. So after that, we should start thinking ourselves and questioning ourselves that what is the etiology for this. So suppose a normal child suddenly comes with a history of encephalopathy in a year, and there's a clear history of trauma, toxin, then it becomes very clear. And if there is a hyperacute presentation, means lasting for less than an hour, so vascular causes can come with such kind of presentation. I'm audible, right?
Yes, you are, Dr. Jeevan. Please continue.
Okay, all right. So if there is a presentation coming, acute presentation lasting less than 2 weeks with fever, altered sensorium, and seizure, then still we should consider infectious etiology with viral most common, and immune-mediated causes like edema and autoimmune encephalitis. And similarly, if there is no history of fever and acute presentation, we should think of whether there is trauma, toxin, or any metabolic causes. And if it's a kind of a subacute presentation lasting more than 2 weeks, and if the fever is a dominant history in more than 2 weeks, then we should think of infection first, with tuberculosis being very common in our Indian setup. And if the history of fever is not very common, but there are other seizure clusters are there, or plus there are some movement disorders are there, then we should think of autoimmune encephalitis and edema at the time. So this is how we roughly think. Then going to the investigation part, immediately when the child, we put the cannula at the time only, better to check for a sugar. Then after that, we like to see the hemoglobin, platelets, how is the renal function, the liver function, what is the sodium of the child, and endemic setup, whether malaria is ruled out or not. And ammonia may help sometimes, and if the cause is very unknown, then sometimes toxic screening of the blood and urine is also helpful. Lumbar puncture will always be helpful to find out whether there is acute infection. And nowadays the meningoencephalitis panels are there, which is covering a number of and the viruses. Second thing is, before planning an LP, we should always see whether there is a feature of raised ICP, papilledema, or focal deficit. For this, rather to do MRI or CT first, then go for a LP second. And MRI is always preferable. However, CT can be useful. It can detect cerebral edema, it can detect abscesses, it can detect any interstitial hemorrhage. So in emergency setup, maybe CT is also maybe useful, but definitely MRI is preferable. So this is some of the MRI finding in most of the viral encephalitis. Like herpes will have typical involvement of medial temporal lobe and orbitobasal part of the frontal lobe. Japanese encephalitis will involve the thalamus and the basal ganglia. The enterovirus will mainly affect the posterior fossa, the brainstem, and the posterior cerebellum, and it also involves anterior horn cell of the spinal cord. Also can present with acute spastic paralysis. West Nile virus mainly involve the deep gray matter and brainstem. Dengue will have a very non-specific kind of dengue, chikungunya, chandigarh. They may have a normal MRI or a non-specific pattern. The virus will have some small subcortical or deep white matter, very small lesions, which suggest a microinfarct. And So EEG, what is the role of EEG in the child coming with such kind of encephalopathy? So definitely EEG will not give us a very direct diagnosis, but it will be definitely helpful in finding out the etiology. If there is a diffuse slowing, it will indicate some kind of encephalitis. It may be viral or autoimmune itself. But in autoimmune, like NMDA, it has a specific like finding delta can be there in some patients. It may have focal slowing or a generalized slowing. And the presence of plates like periodic lateralized epileptiform discharges will suggest a heart. But however, this is not a pathognomic marker, but it will suggest like encephalitis. And EEG will be, of course, helpful in any child coming with altered sensory encephalopathy. Cause is not clear, to look for any suspected non-convulsive status epilepticus, especially in children who are already having an underlying sleep disorder. And it has a role in a child coming with status. And sometimes when the EEG is showing diffuse slowing and the MRI and the EEG is normal, it will help us to decide on immunotherapy as well. Because if the EEG is showing a diffuse slowing, then immunotherapy may help in such cases. So how should we treat this patient? So when the patient comes to the casualty, then before finding the cause, I think better to start as ceftriaxone and acyclovir on a first hand. And if malaria is very endemic, we can start artesunate also same time. See the hemodynamics, manage the shock part, treat the dyselectrolytemia, and for raised ICP features, we give mannitol or NaCl. The child is seizing or had a history of seizure in the past, we can load with phenytoin. Then even in the absence of seizures also, if the child is having a very low GCS and there is a feature of raised ICT, we are just, and steroids like methylprednisolone will be helpful in ADEM, autoimmune encephalitis, and even in viral encephalitis, it's a little controversial because steroids is theoretically causes application of the virus, but it is helpful if the EEG is slow. EEG so slowing, and IVIG is beneficial. The one IGNITE trial in UK is going on. The results are still yet to publish, but it has shown some benefits in the viral encephalitis. So I'll just now touch upon the autoimmune neurological diseases. So initially, autoimmunity as a pathology, we will more rheumatological disorders. But however, the autoimmune diseases can involve any part of the neuroaxis in the CNS. Now the known are the autoimmune encephalitis. Some of them may be seropositive, many of them may be seronegative as well. The demyelinating diseases have underlying autoimmune etiology, CNS vasculitis, Rasmussen encephalitis, opsoclonus, myoclonus, ataxia. They are also supposed to have autoimmune basis. So this is in the brain. So coming to the nerve root and the peripheral nerves, acute and the chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyradiculoneuropathy means the GBS, the acute presentation of GBS, and the chronic kind of presentation like the CIDP. They have autoimmune basis. Myasthenia gravis clearly has autoimmune. There is a demonstrable anti and LPR antibodies. In myopathies like dermatomyositis, ST Person syndrome, and polymyositis also have autoimmune disease. And systemic inflammatory diseases with CNS means the rheumatological disorders can present with a CNS involvement like SLE, Sjogren's, or antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. So classifying this is a rough classification, which shows that if there is a demonstrated immune mechanism like NMDA, limbic encephalitis, they have a demonstrable, and some of them have considered to have a strong suspicion of immune mechanism like opsoclonus, myoclonus ataxia, Hashimoto encephalitis, Bickerstaff encephalitis, Rasmussen's encephalitis, basal ganglia encephalitis. They are strongly suspected to have immune mechanism, and there are some and other disorders like possible immune mechanism like fires, like new child coming with a sudden onset of catastrophic epilepsy. So that is a fires, and our Klippers and Roha. These are rare. I think I'll not go into detail of this. And so these antibodies were actually initially discovered in 80s, early 80s, when the patient with cancer patients, lung cancer and ovarian cancer, and all these cancers used to develop a kind of encephalopathy. Then they recovered this kind of antibodies initially. So it was thought to be a paraneoplastic syndrome. But later on, it was in 2008, NMDA was described in 12 patients of ovarian teratoma. Then there was more than almost 150 patients being reported in literature within 1 year of period. Then subsequently, many antibodies became AMPA antibodies, LG1, Casper, GABA, and still now newer antibodies are still being described in the literature. So these antibodies are mainly against, these antibodies are forms against the surface antibody and the intracellular antigens. So antigens are mainly in the surface and inside the, means on the surface of the neurons and maybe inside. In the surface means like the NMDA and VGKC antibodies. So they are frequently non-paraneoplastic. They are good response to immunotherapy and they have a good prognosis. Whereas the intracellular antigens means like the GAD antibody, they are usually a paraneoplastic origin and immunotherapy is less beneficial and the prognosis is also not very good. So autoimmune encephalitis mainly presents with some acute and many times more commonly a subacute kind of neuropsychiatric symptoms, and they have underlying pure immune. The diagnosis may be very challenging until we really suspect it, because the clinical presentation can vary from case to case. And initially they can just present with psychiatric symptoms, especially in adolescent age group. Like there is one movie made on this with similar symptom based on a true story of one New York journalist. Movie named Brain on Fire. Initially book was published, then a movie came in, and she had only psychiatric symptom, and until she was diagnosed in 2000. This was in 2012. So she has pure psychiatric symptom, but she recovered gradually with immunotherapy. And after this psychiatric symptom, then the child may develop a neurological presentation like a movement disorder, then seizure will come in. Smaller children will more have a neurological presentation, and a bigger child will have more of a psychiatric presentation, and there may be a combination as well. Seizures can be a focal, generalized or multifocal type. More than 30% of the patient will have some movement disorders like chorea, dystonia, or some myoclonus. And these seizures and movement disorders, they are refractory to the standard treatment. Means even if you go 3-4 anti-epileptics, still a child will be continuously throwing seizures. And the hallmark will be some amount of cognitive impairment. So this is one of very cardinal symptoms. So but sometimes it can be very subtle. So we have to really think, we have to really suspect and take out from the history. So when should we consider a possible autoimmune mechanism, especially so when there is a history lasting for less than 3 months with some working memory deficit or altered mental status, especially in a form of change in personality. In children, it may be excessive irritability, maybe not sleeping properly, behavioral changes can be there. And one of the four, like having a new onset of CNS finding. There are frequent seizures which are not being explained by previous seizure disorder. CSF is showing more than 5 cells, and MRI is showing some features of encephalitis. Like I'll be discussing what will be the MRI finding in subsequent slides. So when these combinations are there, though, we should think of a possible autoimmune encephalitis. And especially the NMDA encephalitis is one of the most prototypic type of autoimmune encephalitis. So when should we consider autoimmune this anti-NMDA encephalitis? So when the presentation is less than 3 months, and out of the 6 symptoms, child will have 4 of these. So one will be a psychiatric symptoms. Second will be a speech dysfunction like pressure speech and verbal or mutism. Seizures will be there, movement disorders will be there, decreased consciousness will be there, and some autonomic dysfunction or central hypoventilation will be there. Plus, EEG will be abnormal in a form of focal or some diffuse slowing or some focal or diffuse epileptic activity, and so many cases extreme delta bursts can be there. CSF may show pleocytosis, that is more than 5 cells. And definite means when the antibody is positive and any of the the 6 features that we discussed, any one of them is there, and plus the antibody is there, so it will be an NMDA encephalitis. So just we have to think, and we have to think of all the mimics, which can come like autoimmune encephalitis. EEG will be always helpful because EEG is will be abnormal in most of the patients. And I have already described those findings. MRI can be normal in 60 to 70% of the cases. And many times MRI, there is no any classic MRI pattern for autoimmune encephalitis, because some of them, like if there is an involvement of middle temporal lobe or limbic region, then we will suspect more of a limbic encephalitis. But sometimes there may be very non-specific cortical or some subcortical T2 and flare changes. It will look like some kind of a demyelination also sometimes. So there's no any classical pattern. And CSF will be abnormal in almost 80% of the cases. There will be more than 5 cells and protein may be slightly elevated. Many times CSF may be normal, almost in 20-30% of the cases. Antibody will be picked up in 40-50% of the cases. if there is a good service, better to send a antibody from both serum and CSF. Many times CSF is always have a better sensitivity, and sometimes the antibody level in CSF even correlates with the outcome also. And whenever antibody is positive, like an NMDA, suppose is positive, then we have to actively try to search for any underlying tumor like teratoma or any neuroblastoma like in case of opsoclonus myostaxia. So we have to actively do, and maybe we have to do a MRI of the chest and abdomen and pelvis at the same time. So these are the mimickers of autoimmune encephalitis, like relapsing HSP encephalitis, new onset psychosis, demyelination kind of disorders, CNS, sometimes the inborn error of metabolism, systemic rheumatic disorders like SLE and Sjogren syndrome, and very rarely neurotransmitter disorders. So they all can sometimes present with very similar kind of presentation. We have to keep in mind all these mimickers before we come to a clear diagnosis. So how should we treat about once we come to a probable or a proven autoimmune encephalitis? We'll try to think of any underlying infection or any tumor, then we have to remove the tumor, because until a tumor is removed, the production site will be always there, because this teratoma and all this, they contain NMDA receptors, so there is a continuous source of antibody. So this has to be removed. First line, we'll try with IVIG and methylprednisolone in good setup in a bigger child. Plasma exchange is also going to be very helpful. With that, if they are not, sometime a combination is good, like methylprednisolone, IVIG can be given together also in severe encephalopathy. After that, the child is not responding, then we can go for second line like rituximab and cyclophosphamide. Now, I think for most of the pediatric neurologists throughout the world, rituximab is, I think, kind of a better choice because side effect profiles are less for rituximab. But even cyclophosphamide has a good result. And if the antibody is positive, we have to give like monthly IVIG, or may have to give a prolonged oral steroids, or on top of that, we may give azathioprine, MMF. That has to be decided on case-to-case basis. And so this outcome and the final prognosis, this depends on what kind of encephalitis is there, whether antibody is positive or negative. Like Rasmussen encephalitis, this 5 years will have a very bad prognosis. In spite of giving a lot of immunotherapy, child will still have a lot of seizures. And there will be a atrophy of the brain and kind of a very bad prognosis. And NMDA, VGKC, they have a good prognosis. Almost 80% of the NMDA encephalitis will have full recovery, and the recovery may last for almost 2 years after the presentation. If the antibody is positive, almost 25% of these NMDA patients can relapse independent of the age of onset. And some of them may need a very long-term immunotherapy. There is no clear-cut guideline to how long we should give, so it depends on case-to-case basis. So I'd just like to give final take-home messages. So these are not very, these are the newer disorders which are described, but these are not rare as thought of in the past. High index of suspicion is always needed because presentation is very variable, and we should think of mimickers all the time. And early diagnosis and the aggressive immunotherapy will definitely change the outcome of the child. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. G, for condensing your expertise in the area of autoimmune encephalitis into a brief presentation. We now welcome our last presenter for the evening, Dr. Meenal Garg. Dr. Meenal Garg has completed her MBBS and her MD Pediatrics from the Baba Farid University of Health Sciences, Faridkot in Punjab. She acquired her fellowship in pediatric neurology from Wadia Hospital, Mumbai. She has been actively working in the arena of pediatrics since 2014 and is currently an epilepsy consultant, pediatric neurologist at Surya Hospital, Jaipur. Dr. Meenal very passionately wishes to benefit the lives of children with neurological handicaps with her clinical skills. She also aims to increase awareness regarding the management of the pediatric neurological disorders among everyone. Dr. Meenal, we wish you all the best for this noble outlook of yours, and with that, we welcome you aboard. Over to you, Dr. Meenal.
Am I on?
Yeah. No, it's not audible.
Hi, so good evening, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, and we can.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So thank you for the nice introduction, and I welcome all those who have been with us for the past half hour. Dr. Jeevan has actually given us a very nice presentation. He's given a great overview and built a good basis for me to go forward. So I'll be discussing something specific about autoimmune encephalitis. We'll see a few patients, and I'll be talking about some practical points on how to diagnose and how to manage these children. So in his talk, Dr. Jeevan mentioned that there was a book written by a patient who had autoimmune encephalitis, and as you can see on the screen, so the patient, she titled the book Brain on Fire. So I think that is a very appropriate title for our presentation today, and it aptly describes what autoimmune encephalitis is all about. So we'll just move over and we'll start with the case. So this was a 4-year-old girl who was initially brought to us with 1 month history of intermittent fever without any localizing symptoms. Now, surprisingly, this patient had not been given any antibiotics in the last 1 month, and was on some Ayurvedic treatment which she was doing on OPD basis. So she had done some investigations during this period and blood counts were normal. Now, 15 days after her fever onset, she developed a lot of behavioral changes. She was increasingly irritable. She was very restless, agitated. She started biting her parents. She lost her toilet training and had encopresis and enuresis. Her sleep-wake pattern was disturbed. And there was one clear episode of visual hallucination, which was noted by the mother. So this is sort of a video of what the patient looked like. So on admission, she had low-grade fever. She had stable vital signs, but she was very agitated. She was moving around in the bed. She would not respond to any verbal commands, and she would get aggressive in between. She could localize pain and did not have any clear-cut focal deficits. Her eye exam was normal. So all the routine investigations that we did initially, CBC and all those things, they came out to be normal. We did an MRI brain with contrast that did not show us any changes, and we did a EEG which showed a generalized slowing of the background activity. So now obviously we know what we are talking about. We're talking about autoimmune encephalitis. But what happens when you see a child like this? So you have a child with a febrile encephalopathy with neuropsychiatric symptoms. So what do you think of? Obviously, we'll think of infectious causes first, as Dr. Jeevan already told us. They are more common, they are more likely to be apparent in our population. So when we investigated her in detail, we found that her blood culture was positive and it grew Salmonella typhi, which was multi-drug sensitive. So obviously it was community acquired. But we felt that there was something extra to her predicament, to the type she was presenting. We know that typhoid encephalopathy has been very well described in literature, but still we went ahead, we investigated this patient further. So CSF routine did not show us anything except mild pleocytosis, but her CSF anti-NMDAR antibodies were positive. So we treated this patient, and this was a rare patient who had an association of typhoid with anti-NMDAR encephalitis. So we treated her with immunosuppression and we treated her with antimicrobials. She responded beautifully and she was absolutely normal on follow-up. So why we are discussing this is we are just wanting to highlight that even in patients with absolutely other, where we have another etiology, we can still have associated autoimmune diseases. So this Dr. Jeevan has covered nicely. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. We know that there is a spectrum of autoimmune CNS encephalitis, which is expanding every day, and more disorders are now coming under the umbrella of possible autoimmune disorder. So when we think of autoimmune encephalitis, as ma'am initially said when she was talking about it, is it a new entity? When we were medical students, we had not heard of it, and now we are hearing it everywhere. So just to go back, there was a big project known as the California Encephalitis Project, which was initiated some 20 years back. So what they did was they took the encephalitis patients from the state of California in the United States, and they enrolled something more than 300 patients, and they evaluated these patients for a number of etiologies, infectious etiologies. But what they found was that even after extensive testing, which was available 20 years back, obviously not today, but they found that in around 60% of the patients, they could not find any diagnosis. So the change came when in 2005, a new syndrome of neuropsychiatric manifestations was discovered in women with ovarian teratoma. So in the next 3 years, there was a sudden explosion when they went back and tested more and more patients who had had similar symptoms, and they found more than 400 patients in 3 years alone. Some of them without an and more increasingly children. And of course, this was the anti-NMDR receptor encephalitis, which was discovered by Dr. Dalmau and his team. And this changed perception, our understanding, and our approach to acute encephalopathy completely. So what happened? Initially, we had one antibody that was discovered in around 2005 or 6, and then each year we are getting a new antibody, and the spectrum is widening and widening, and now we have more than 10 which we can discover on a commercial, which we can, diagnose on a commercial basis. So when they went back,
your slides are not visible, doctor.
they're not visible.
Yes, ma'am.
You can share it, I think.
Yeah. Are they visible now?
Yes, ma'am. Perfect.
Yes, no.
Okay, I'll just repeat a little bit. I think if nothing was visible. Okay, so this was the book that we were talking about. This was the child whose case we had discussed, and this is just a video. I would like to have you to have a look at it. So this was the child that presented to us with 1 month of fever and neuropsychiatric manifestations. So here we found the blood culture, which grew Salmonella typhi, and then the CSF anti-NMDR antibody, which was positive. So just as I said before, so we can have this rare associations, and even in children who have other infective disorders, we can still have anti-NMDR encephalitis. So there is something which was previously described as typhoid encephalopathy, which is a well-described entity in older papers. So it is possible that that had an autoimmune basis, which we might be able to discover now as we test more and more patients. So again, is it a new entity? So going back to the California Encephalitis Project, a lot of patients who were not found to have anything, even after extensive testing, around 62%. So then came the discovery of anti-NMDR receptor encephalitis by Dr. Dalmau and his team. And then we discovered newer antibodies every year. So now we have more than 10 or 12 antibodies, which we can do on a commercial basis. So when they went back and they tested the patients in the California Encephalitis Project who had similar symptoms and did not have a diagnosis before, they found that when they took a single infective agent, anti-NMDR was found to be much more common than any single infective agent. And even as a group, it was almost equivalent to the infective group. So it is not a new disease. Our understanding of it is improving. The spectrum is expanding, and we are suspecting and diagnosing it more and more, but it's always been there. So obviously now we want to look at the patients. We want to see what kind of patients should we be looking at who may have this disorder. So the exact incidence is still unknown. As we've just discussed, we are diagnosing more and more patients, especially children, young adults. So obviously the incidence is going to change for some of the coming years. It is an autoimmune disorder, so younger patients, less than 12 years, prepubertal, the incidence in male and female patients will be equal. But post-pubertal or pubertal patients, there is a female preponderance. Male patients rarely have tumors, but in adolescent girls, we have to always look and surveil for an ovarian teratoma, and that is the most common association. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how this syndrome present and what do the different stages look like. So many patients have a prodrome. Around 70% would have headache, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, which lasts for around 5 days.
Any problem? I think you are not audible now, Dr. Garg.
Ma'am, we'll just check it, ma'am.
Hi, can you help me out because the slide doesn't seem to be working.
Sure, ma'am.
So I'll just request you all to hold on. There seems to be some problem. Okay. So after this prodromal phase, the next comes the psychotic phase, where the child might have anxiety, fear, delusions. There is stereotypical behavior, social withdrawal, memory loss, and cognitive decline. And very often there are speech issues with the reduction of the verbal output, echolalia, and mutism. In children, this stage is often missed because they often have strange behavior, temper tantrums, hyperactivity, or irritability. Karan, the video is not playing. Can you just help me out?
Uh, yes, ma'am. Sure, ma'am. Just give me 2 minutes. I'll just look into it. Now is it fine, ma'am?
Yeah, it's
Okay. Sure.
so this is sort of how these children might present in this phase. And this kind of strange behavior, temper tantrums, and hyperactivities may sometimes be missed. After this comes the phase of altered sensorium and seizures. And these children have a lot of autonomic manifestations with hypothermia, apneic spells, hypoventilation, and BP fluctuations. And then comes the hyperkinetic phase, where there are a host of abnormal movements, including orofacial lingual dyskinesias, which are very frequent, motions of arms and legs, oculogyric crisis, and rigidity. So these is some of these kind of movements which are seen. Some of these movements are very hard to characterize, but they are very, very frequent. And as soon as you see these movements, it produces a suspicion of autoimmune encephalitis, more likely. And then comes the recovery phase, which may be gradual, variable, and appears in weeks to months. So just to show, this is the child in the previous slide. And after a few days of methylprednisolone, she is much more restful. The abnormal movements have decreased, and she's much more responsive to her mother. And obviously, some patients are left with cognitive deficits. So in children, neurological presentations are much more common because the earlier phases are missed, while in older children, psychiatric symptoms are more common, and autonomic dysfunction is less commonly seen as compared to older children or adults. So why does this happen? So the NMDA is a surface glutamate receptors. When antibodies are formed against that, these antibodies bind to the surface receptor and leads to its internalization. So what happens when there is a decrease of NMDAR? It produces autonomic instability. There is an increase in extracellular glutamate and an inactivation of the GABAergic neurons, leading to a disinhibition. So this produces a lot of psychosis, catatonia, it produces a lot of movement disorders, and the effect on the pontine medullary respiratory pathway produces hypoventilation and autonomic manifestations. So there are a number of associations which are reported in literature and small reports. We discussed about typhoid. Antimycoplasma antibodies are very frequently found, but their significance is unclear in these kind of autoimmune encephalitis and a lot of other infections that are reported. But one association which is well characterized is NMDA receptor antibodies in post-HSV encephalitis. So many reports have conclusively shown that the relapse of HSV is frequently associated with anti-NMDA positivity in adults as well as in children. So if the relapse is related to an autoimmune phenomena, then immunomodulation is the treatment. So frequently in the past also we have seen this kind of phenomena, but
दीदी
we
बोलता रहे
don't know
दीदी
the
फोटो नहीं आ
disease.
रही दीदी बोल रही है ना शायद
Now we
पता
know
नहीं
that this is an autoimmune phenomena which has led to
हाँ तो आवाज फोटो के लिए आ रही
Dr. Garg, you are not audible now.
Ma'am, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay. Now am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay. So frequently what we see is there is a diffuse slowing of the background activity. Mostly we have not seen any patient who has had a normal EEG, but literature says that more than 90% the EEG is abnormal. Sometimes there might be focal slowing also, and frequently we see epileptiform discharges. Now this pattern is commonly described in around 30% of the patients. It is called an extreme delta brush. So you see a delta wave, and on that you see a very fast rhythmic beta activity, but it's not very common in children. If it is seen, it is quite specific for autoimmune, especially NMDR encephalitis. And then because many patients have lots of seizures, especially subclinical seizures, continuous EEG monitoring may be indicated. So CSF studies are become virtually abnormal in all of the patients in the later stages of the disease. You can see a mild lymphocytic pleocytosis. You can see raised protein in many of these patients. Oligoclonal bands are frequently found. And CSF anti-NMDR antibody is the most specific test. So serum antibodies do not correlate well with the disease. Many patients who have CSF antibodies might not have serum antibodies. And then in the later stages of the disease, when the antibodies disappear from the CSF, they may still persist in serum. So in these patients, we have to do a CSF test. Best is a paired CSF and serum test, but frequently we have cost limitations. So for NMDA, CSF studies are the best, but for the rest of the antigens, obviously plasma studies are the best. So this is kind of a schema of how we approach autoimmune encephalitis. So when we suspect it on the basis of clinical MRI and CSF features, we try and rule out other etiologies first and then send autoantibodies. But obviously, just as I said, the practice is now changing. We do suspect it at the first instance, and then we can initiate an immunotherapy trial early. We send the antibodies, it takes some time to come back, and meanwhile we can give immunotherapy. And that also acts as kind of a mini diagnostic test. If your patient starts responding to your methylprednisolone trial, that does mean that an autoimmune phenomena is involved and it might help. So as pediatricians, we use methylprednisolone first, followed by IVIG. Plasma exchange is a little difficult, little cumbersome to do in children, so we keep it for last, or we try it in older children. And then if these two don't work, then what we do is, if the child is very stable, we send them home on oral steroids and we call them back for weekly rituximab, which is the third line treatment that we are using, 375 mg per meter square. We call them weekly, and then we keep assessing the response and see how they're doing. Cyclophosphamide we use less, but due to cost constraints, we might need to use this monthly cyclophosphamide. And then if this doesn't work, then we go on to further immunotherapy. So as we discussed, in older children, we have to do an MRI, ultrasound or CT study for tumor surveillance. We might need to keep doing it in older girls for, we do 6 monthly MRIs for 2 to 3 years to look for a teratoma. And if you can find a tumor early, you have to remove it. So now coming on to a different type of encephalitis. This was a 4-year-old girl who presented with acute onset of fever, altered sensorium and multiple seizures. As you can see in this video, so she's having a complex partial seizure. She's having a focal seizure with impaired awareness. So this was a left-sided hemiclonic seizure with movements of the face. So she had a lot of refractory seizures and she was not responding to my anti-seizure drugs. This was a scan. So you can see that bilaterally in the hippocampus, there is diffusion restriction and there were T2 hyperintensities. So CSF showed mild pleocytosis, and HSV PCR would be the first diagnosis that we think of in such a child. It was negative. So we tested her for NMDA, it was negative as well. But we treated her as epic encephalitis, and although we were not able to do further antibodies in this child, we gave her a treatment of immunotherapy. She responded well, her seizures disappeared, and she was doing well on follow-up. So limbic encephalitis has been known for a long time as a complication of the paraneoplastic antibodies, as we discussed before. In children, it is less common. It may be associated with a host of antibodies, including NMDA, VGKC, that means LG1 and Caspr2 antibodies, anti-GABA, AMPA-B. So we have panels that we can do and test for that. But the main thing is when you see such an MRI, think of HSV, then think of limbic encephalitis and treat with immunosuppression. So just an overview of some of the other antibody mediated encephalitides, because I'm not going to be going into the details of this. So LG1 presents with faciobrachial dystonic seizures. Hyponatremia in the earlier phases is a characteristic feature. So Caspr2, it is also present in the peripheral nervous system. So it can present with peripheral nerve hyperexcitability, neuromyotonia, Morvan syndrome. And as I said before, AMPA and GABA-A, GABA-B can present with limbic encephalitis. So just one point about the seronegative autoimmune encephalitis. So if you have this kind of a clinical picture, you've excluded well-defined syndromes of autoimmune encephalitis like Bickerstaff and ADEM, but you're not able to find any antibodies in a specific child, then it might qualify for seronegative autoimmune encephalitis. So we do find a lot of these cases. So if you have the clinical picture, but you're not able to find any antibodies, we can still treat them with immunotherapy, provided all other causes are ruled out. Most of the other causes, there is a reasonable exclusion criteria. So just keep this in mind that many of the cases that we see, around half of them, even up to half, may be seronegative. And the second thing is we are not able to test because of cost constraints for all the antibodies. So it's possible that we might be missing something in the out of the whole panel. So just to shift focus to a different type of autoimmune encephalopathy, this was a 14-year-old girl. She came with one-day history of non-projectile vomiting, followed by unresponsiveness, irritability, low GCS. She did not have any focal signs at admission, no meningeal signs, eye examination, tone, brainstem were normal, only the GCS was low. And she had one prolonged seizure in the hospital and needed to be ventilated. So obviously we went through the whole gamut. We did her metabolic workup, we did her routine investigations, everything came out to be normal. She did have high value of serum lactate, but everything else, MRI was normal, CSF did not show any pleocytosis or oligoclonal bands, proteins were normal. EEG showed generalized slowing of the background activity. We did a toxicology screen, we did a complete CSF and serum profile for autoimmune encephalitis, ANA, porphobilinogen, everything was normal. However, her TSH was mildly low, but the T4, free T4 was all normal. So that led us to the suspicion, and we did her antithyroid antibodies. So antithyroperoxidase and thyroglobulin antibodies were both positive. So we diagnosed this patient. Initially, we started IVIG because we felt that we could not exclude the infectious encephalitis in the earlier phases, but she did not respond to that. When we got these antibodies positive, we started her on steroids and she responded very nicely. So this was a patient with Hashimoto encephalopathy. So we know that it is an uncommon disorder in children and not a lot of patients have been described. However, it is likely underdiagnosed and underreported. There are many patients who present with a variety of symptoms, encephalopathy, seizures, movement disorders, recurrent strokes, which are described in the literature. Now, anti-TPO and anti-thyroglobulin antibodies are markers for this disease, but we also know that these antibodies occur in a lot of normal people and they occur in patients with hypothyroidism. So are they really the pathogenic markers for this disease, or are they just an indicator of an autoimmune process? So we don't know that, but if we find these antibodies in a patient with unexplained encephalopathy, we should treat them as Hashimoto, and the treatment for this is immunomodulation. So just to highlight the point that there are many antibodies and presentations that we can think of in a child like this, and all of them will also come under autoimmune encephalitis. So just a couple of videos. Another autoimmune process. Many of you must have seen children like this presenting. So you can see this child, he's having a lot of jerky movements. He's not able to sit still. He's looking very drowsy and encephalopathic. And another video just to highlight the eyes in these patients. So many of you must have guessed, this is the dancing eyes, dancing feet syndrome as it was called previously. And now we know it as opsoclonus myoclonus ataxia or opsoclonus myoclonus syndrome, OMS. So this is another paraneoplastic autoimmune disorder, which probably targets the cerebellum. There are a host of immunomodulatory treatments that we use for it: ACTH, IVIG, methylprednisolone. And now what we are using is pulse oral DEXA monthly along with rituximab, which is giving us good results. So just to summarize, a high index of suspicion is necessary in autoimmune encephalitis. Underdiagnosis is very common, and the most common first diagnosis in these patients is viral encephalitis. Syndrome identification is important for treatment as well as follow-up and to decide the duration of therapy. So even if you're not suspecting it in the initial phase, but you're doing a lumbar puncture to exclude viral encephalitis, just preserve one CSF sample. Because later on, when you're suspecting, parents will not allow for a repeat lumbar puncture. And for things like NMDA, you won't be able to rule it out because you don't have CSF. So just keep one CSF sample extra in the fridge and it is not destroyed for a few days. And if everything turns out to be negative, you can at least send that for testing and start immunotherapy. So prompt initiation of immunotherapy can be life-saving. Even if you think that the patient might be having some infectious process, 1 or 2 doses of methylprednisolone probably won't harm the patient. And if you have reasonably excluded other things, you can start immunotherapy and see the response. It will also act as a mini diagnostic test. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Meenal, for visually driving today's evening session on autoimmune encephalitis. We now welcome back Dr. Mridula ma'am for her to share her experience and expertise. Dr. Mridula ma'am.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again. Well, what the discussion I was hearing from Dr. Silwal as well as Dr. Garg, it is a wonderful presentation and the things which were not really clear to us. I think after this presentation by both of them, many causes of encephalopathy, presentations of encephalopathy is a little clear, at least for general pediatricians. When a patient comes to the emergency room or in our office practice, I don't feel sorry to say, I feel sorry to say, but I'm not really very expert on this type of diseases. But I can see next time when a patient comes like this, I think I'll not miss, or I'll keep it in my mind. But only thing is, it's very costly. Investigations, treatment, and everything. And in Indian population, I don't know. I just wanted to ask Dr. Garg, if suppose a patient comes and he or she is not able to do all these investigations, we can still go on to for this methylprednisolone or IVIG, and of course we should rule out pyogenic meningitis. What is your opinion, Dr. Garg?
So ma'am, that's what we do. We try to do an MRI and CSF early. We try to do a EEG. And if we are not able to find any, and we are reasonably sure that there is not a serious infection, we do start methylprednisolone. And commercially, when we do these antibodies at, like, if you do them at Metropolis or something, they're very costly. But as Dr. Silwal can also tell you, we send our antibodies to Kochi. So Amrita Institute at Kochi has a very nice neuroimmunology lab. And the antibodies there, the tests are much cheaper than those available in commercial labs. So we do send a lot of antibodies to them. They have nice panels, and NMD antibody there costs around 3,000 rupees. So that many patients are able to afford. Along with the courier and everything, it costs them around 3,500. So many antibodies we are sending there.
Okay, nice again that you have shared. I think if there is any question from the audience, we can go ahead with that questions. Because encephalopathy, psychological disorders, autoimmune encephalitis, well, we can see there is demyelinating diseases. There's much of overlap. And yeah, you spoke very nicely, both of you. Any question? Any question from the audience?
Ma'am, someone has asked how common is sleep disturbance in autoimmune encephalitis? So
yeah, Dr. Garg.
Dr. Meenal can answer maybe. How common is sleep disturbance in autoimmune encephalitis?
So it is very common. That's what I found. There is a change in sleep pattern in many of the children. When you ask the parents very carefully, they will say that the child is sleepy during the day and he or she is awake during the night. Or there is a change from the previous, the child is sleeping too much or too less. And I find it to be a very common finding.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very common actually. Sleep issues are very common.
Any other
I
question?
think, no, ma'am. I think there are no further questions.
No, there is one question. How long methylpred treatment is to be given? From Mr. Mahipal.
So methylprednisolone we give initially for around 5 days, and then we put the child on oral steroids, and then we keep on assessing the response to the treatment. The second thing that we give is IVIG. Again, both of them take some time to work. But as a pulse therapy, usually 5 days is the most common duration that we use. If you find that there is an association, it is associated with something else, there is an infection, you might even give it for 3 days. But most children do require 5 days of treatment.
Okay, another thing about the third line treatment, you said it is the rituximab, is
Yes.
it? And what about the plasmapheresis and others? You do it, Dr. Silva, or is it recommended?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, if the thing is, ma'am, actually plasma exchange is good, but thing is
It is
we need to
difficult.
have a very good ICU setup because they may have because especially children, it will be difficult, ma'am. Practically, it is recommended for children more than 25 kilo, bigger children, and with severe features. Even after IVIG, also if not recovering, then sometime we may go up for a plasma action. But I think only few centers are doing not because the backup, the ICU backup is very important.
And another thing is about the vaccine, the autoimmune disorders of encephalitis, the vaccines are also seen, recorded at least. Dr. Garg, yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't catch you. I couldn't
The vaccines, even the vaccines can cause the autoimmune encephalitis. What is your, you have seen many cases, or
No.
what is your experience? And what
No.
are the vaccines which can produce this type of symptoms?
So, ma'am, in literature, there are few case reports, unpublished reports, and there are few case series where they've said that influenza vaccines or a few other vaccines can produce. But it might be just a antigenic association. We don't know because now the spectrum is expanding. But practically, I've not found that patient has come with a very specific history of having immunization and then getting autoimmune encephalitis. So, as such, it might be after any infection. So, the prodrome might be there for any infection. So practically I've not found a great association, but literature there are a few case reports.
Okay,
It's
thank you.
mainly, ma'am, ADEM is the common one, ma'am, especially
Yeah,
after infection.
exactly.
ADEM, yes,
ADEM
ma'am.
is the one.
More
ADEM is
common
very
than the.
common. We have seen many cases of ADEM and we have treated
Yes, ma'am.
even in the Shiliguri. You have also treated. ADEM is
Yes, ma'am. ADEM, yes, ma'am. ADEM patients are like, I think it is one of the common autoimmune neurological commonest one is the ADEM, I think. All
And
of
we
us.
have seen many cases, all of us, and it is even there in the books also, Nelson and other books. But this other autoimmune encephalitis, it is yet to come in the textbooks, I think. Thank you very much.
It has come.
Yeah.
Recent Nelson has given a chapter on autoimmune encephalitis, ma'am. Very good chapters, ma'am. In the 20th edition itself, it is very good. The person who have discovered NMDA, that Joseph Dalmau, has written the chapter, ma'am. Very nice chapters.
We have to go through that. Then I'll recommend. Now, actually, it is very difficult, it's so vast.
Yes.
Everything is so vast. The pediatrics as such, the knowledge is also vast. But whatever, it is very, very good presentation because it is clear. A patient, what we label as encephalopathy, may be having either viral encephalitis or bacterial encephalitis, meningitis, or it could be autoimmune disorders, ADEM, or some remyelintic diseases, and even the toxins. We have seen many cases of toxins, poisons. They present with this encephalopathy features. Difficult to diagnose, difficult to differentiate, but we have to keep it in our mind, isn't it? Regarding autoimmune, it is a new entity, unique entity, and we should be a little careful. As you said, Dr. Gar, that keep one CSF in the refrigerator for a few days. At least one sample should be kept. If everything comes out to be normal, then we can go for autoimmune.
Just one thing I would like to add, ma'am. So NMDA is the one that is mostly tested in the CSF, but for the others, NMO, MOG, VGKC, the plasma sample is better. So mostly for NMDA and oligoclonal bands and those things, we need to keep the CSF sample. Most of the other antibodies, we can as well test that in the serum also.
One thing, the serum also, you are going to keep it in the freeze for a few days?
Yes, ma'am. We do that. We keep a serum sample also. So before the initiation of methylprednisolone.
That is a good presentation. Everything is fine. I think there is no more question. So
probably we can just request any of the doctors in the audience to share their questions on the chat box. They can also mention the name of the doctor before the question. Meanwhile, there's during the registration itself, we had encouraged doctors to ask questions. So there's one particular question from one of the attendees. They wanted to know the perspective of Indian doctors towards the treatment of autoimmune encephalitis. It's directed to all three of you all.
So, Dr. Jeevan, would you like to answer?
Yeah, I think mainly the thing is autoimmune encephalitis is a kind of very new thing. So many of us may not believe that it exists until we really see the patients. So even before going for our pediatric neuro training, in our PG days, I remember seeing very few cases of autoimmune encephalitis. So until we see and until we really see the cases, we don't believe actually. So many times I think it is still in a growing phase. And especially among the pediatricians, it is even challenging because we are not seeing much of cases. So maybe the pediatric neurology, the branch itself is actually very in a very early phase in India. So I think it is still yet a long way to go because this is a new thing, and pediatric neurologists are now the trainees are coming out. So they are the one who more frequently sees and suspect even in the common scenario. So I think it is still in a growing phase. I think definitely.
So the more we test, the more positive patients we get.
So the more we test, then we come to realize that this really exists. Even like the cases of simple transverse myelitis, we are coming with recurrent transverse myelitis with some optic neuritis. Now they are like NMO and MOG antibodies are there. They're coming positive. Even with actually the ADEM, all these ADEM patients, 30 to 50% patients are having a MOG antibody positive. That's now we are coming to know this thing. So relapsing ADEM patients are actually MOG antibody patients. So until we really test, so we don't know it, and it's still autoimmune neurology. Especially in pediatric, it's still going, the studies are going on, things are changing on. So I think it's still in the beginning phase.
So somebody has asked a question on how to approach antibody negative cases. So I have a few patients, most of them, the patients who have come with monophasic illnesses, most of them have done very well after methylprednisolone, IVIG and a prolonged course of oral steroids. Most of them have not needed anything else like mycophenolate or azathioprine on a long-term basis or repeat courses of IVIG. The patients who present with a Fires-like presentation initially and are antibody negative, those patients do less well in the long term. They tend to be epileptic for a long time, and over time they do become refractory to even the autoimmune treatment. So the one with Fires-like presentation and those who are antibody negative, they don't do so well. But those with kind of a monophasic illness, more of a typical autoimmune encephalitis presentation, all of those patients have done very well on methylprednisolone, IVIG, and then oral steroids.
But still, I think autoimmune antibodies we must detect. We should detect.
Yes.
That's the mystery of diagnosis of the disease.
Ma'am, for that, cost again is the main issue with us. The more we test, the cost bearing for the patient increases tremendously. So at a point, most of them will say that we can't do it anymore.
And there are other issues, social issues, medical legal issues. We should not forget about these things also, isn't it? Okay. I think we can finish it now, Dr. Silval and Dr.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for moderating us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just, well, you are the experts. And lastly, of course, we have to give thanks to Plasma Gen. Okay, company, they have arranged it, and a subject which
Plasma Gen team, I think
not very clear to the common general pediatricians. Thank you again.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Mridula, ma'am, Dr. Garg, Dr. Silwal. And a very good evening, one and all in the audience. On behalf of the entire Plasmagen Biosciences family, including our IVIG range of plasma group, 0.5, 2.5 gram, 5 gram, and 10 gram, I cordially thank you all to come and spend your Friday evening with us. Plasmagen Biosciences is proud to have put together this webinar under the kind and patient guidance of Dr. Mridula, ma'am, Dr. Neenil Garg, and Dr. Jeevan Silwal. For those who joined in late into the session or might have missed out a few crucial minutes, please be assured we'll be sharing the link to the entire session at the earliest with you via email. We do have your contact details and we eagerly look forward to connecting with you soon for our future sessions. Thank you once again and good night from all of us at Plasmagen Biosciences.
Good night.
Thank you, Siva and Dika. Thank you.
We're all there now. Only our Plasmagen people.
No, sir, a couple of doctors are there.
Okay. Shivantika?
Yes, Harshi, sir?
It's all our people only now, no?
Yes, sir. There are a couple of guests leaving.
Shaila, Arun, Harish Vaigankar, okay. Rathod, Abdul Temkar, Silvadurai, Ramanaidu.
Yes, sir. Now it's more. It's all of it. It's Plasmagen. This is just a second.
Harish is there? Okay.
Yes,
No,
sir.
sir.
Harish is left, okay.
Yes.
It's all now us only, right?
Yes, sir. Looks like it. Yes, sir.
Okay. Good. Good show. There was some difficulty in between, right? There was some screen was not seen and the audio was not.